"You're weak, just like your mother," he used to say, constantly putting me down, pointing fingers. Until one day I saw him in a car with another woman and decided to tell the whole family about it. Growing up, my grandfather's house was like walking into a minefield every single time. The man had this way of looking at you that made your skin crawl, like he was sizing you up and finding you wanting before you even opened your mouth. I was probably 7 when I first remember him calling me soft. Not in a gentle way, not like he was worried about me getting hurt in the world. More like he was disgusted by what he saw. My parents would drop me off there after school sometimes when they were both working late. Those afternoons felt like they lasted forever. He'd sit in his big leather recliner, remote in one hand, beer in the other, and just watch me do my homework at the kitchen table. Every mistake I made, every time I had to erase something, he'd make this clicking sound with his tongue, like he was keeping score of my failures. The comparisons to my mom started early too. She was his daughter, but you'd never know it from how he talked about her. According to him, she was too emotional, too gentle, raised me wrong, made me into something that wouldn't survive in the real world. He'd say this stuff right in front of me, like I wasn't even there. Sometimes I'd catch my grandmother giving him these looks, but she never said anything, just kept cooking or cleaning or whatever she was doing. Middle school was rough for me anyway. I wasn't good at sports, wasn't particularly popular, spent most of my time reading or playing video games. Normal stuff for a lot of kids, but in my grandfather's eyes, it was evidence of everything wrong with my generation. He'd tell stories about his own childhood, how he was working construction at 14, how kids today didn't know what real work was. The way he said it, you'd think I was personally responsible for the downfall of society. High school didn't make things better. I tried playing football for exactly 1 season, thinking maybe it would get him off my back. Spent most of the time on the bench, came home with more bruises from practice than I ever got in games. He'd ask about it every Sunday dinner, and when I told him I was thinking about quitting, the disappointment on his face was so thick you could cut it with a knife. He didn't even try to talk me out of it. Just shook his head and muttered something about how his generation fought wars and mine quit football. The Sunday dinners were the worst part. Every week, the whole family would gather at his house. My parents, my aunt and uncle, my cousins. My grandmother would spend all day cooking this huge meal, and we'd all sit around this massive dining room table that probably cost more than my parents' car. He'd hold court from the head of the table, telling the same stories we'd heard 100 times, making the same jokes that stopped being funny years ago. But he'd always find time to single me out, ask me about school in a way that felt like a cross-examination. When I told him I was thinking about studying literature in college, he actually laughed. Not a happy laugh, but this bitter, mocking sound. Asked me what I was planning to do with that, teach other kids to be soft like me. My parents would try to change the subject, but the damage was always done. I'd spend the rest of the meal feeling like I was about 2 inches tall. By the time I turned 18, I pretty much accepted that this was just how things were going to be. Some people have grandfathers who teach them to fish or take them to baseball games. I had one who seemed to think his job was to prepare me for a world that would chew me up and spit me out. Maybe he thought he was helping in some twisted way. Maybe he genuinely believed that toughening me up was what I needed. College gave me some distance, but not enough. I stayed local, partly because of money, partly because I wasn't ready to be completely on my own yet. The Sunday dinners continued. If anything, they got worse. Now he had new material to work with. My major was a waste of time. My part-time job wasn't real work. The girl I was dating freshman year wasn't pretty enough, and when we broke up, it was because I didn't know how to treat a woman right. I started making excuses to skip dinner sometimes. Had to work, had to study, wasn't feeling well. My mom would give me these worried looks, but she never pushed. I think she understood, even if she couldn't say anything. My dad would just nod when I begged off, like he got it too. Maybe they'd both been through their own version of this with him over the years. The thing is, I wasn't even that soft. I mean, I wasn't going to win any tough guy contests, but I held down jobs, got decent grades, had friends. I could change a tire and unclog a drain and all the basic stuff you're supposed to know how to do. But none of that mattered to him. In his eyes, I was this weak, pathetic thing that needed to be constantly reminded of how disappointing I was. By my junior year of college, I'd started to wonder if maybe he was right. Maybe I was weak. Maybe I was letting life happen to me instead of taking control. The self-doubt was eating at me from the inside. I'd lie awake at night sometimes, replaying all the things he'd said over the years, wondering if this was just who I was destined to be. That's when everything changed. Update 1. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October. I'd finished my classes early and decided to hit the mall to kill some time before work. Nothing special, just wandering around. Maybe grab some food court Chinese food, check out the bookstore. The kind of mindless activity that helps you decompress after a long day of lectures and note-taking. I was walking past the department store when I saw his car in the parking lot. Couldn't miss it. He'd had the same dark blue Buick for probably 15 years. Kept it so clean you could eat off the hood. Thought it was weird that he'd be at the mall in the middle of the afternoon. He was retired, sure, but he usually spent his days at home, working in his garage or watching TV. Shopping wasn't really his thing. Curiosity got the better of me. I figured maybe he was picking something up for my grandmother, or maybe they were meeting up for dinner later. I walked over toward the car, thinking I'd say hi, maybe even offer to help carry whatever he was buying. It would be nice to have a normal conversation with him for once, away from the family dinner table where he felt like he had to perform. That's when I saw them. He was in the driver's seat, but he wasn't alone. There was a woman next to him, probably in her 60s, with short gray hair and bright red lipstick. They were talking, and she was laughing at something he'd said. Her hand was on his arm. And then, while I stood there frozen about 20 feet away, he leaned over and kissed her. Not a peck on the cheek. Not a friendly goodbye kiss. A real kiss, the kind married people give each other when they think nobody's watching. The kind of kiss that made it crystal clear this wasn't his first time with this woman. My stomach dropped through the floor. I felt like I was going to throw up right there in the parking lot. This was my grandfather, the man who'd spent my entire life lecturing me about character and responsibility and doing the right thing. The man who criticized everything I did, every choice I made, every sign of weakness he thought he saw in me. And here he was, cheating on my grandmother like it was the most natural thing in the world. I ducked behind a car and watched them for a few more minutes. They sat there talking, her hand still on his arm, both of them looking comfortable and familiar in a way that told me this had been going on for a while. Eventually, she got out and walked toward the mall entrance. He sat there for a minute, checking his hair in the rearview mirror, then drove off like nothing had happened. I stood there in that parking lot for probably 20 minutes, trying to process what I'd just seen. Part of me wanted to convince myself I'd misunderstood somehow, that there was an innocent explanation. Maybe she was an old friend, maybe the kiss was just, but no. I knew what I'd seen. There was no innocent explanation for what had just happened. The drive home was a blur. I kept thinking about my grandmother, about how she'd spent that morning probably cooking his lunch, maybe planning what to make for dinner. How she'd ask him about his day when he got home, and he'd probably lie without missing a beat. How long had this been going on? Months? Years? Did anyone else know? For the next few weeks, I carried this secret around like a weight in my chest. Every time I saw him, every time he made one of his comments about my character or my choices, I wanted to scream. Here was this man who'd appointed himself the moral authority of our family, and he was living a lie. The hypocrisy was suffocating. I started paying more attention to him at family dinners. The way he'd check his phone, how he'd sometimes step outside to take calls, how he'd mention running errands that seemed to take longer than they should. Details I'd never noticed before suddenly seemed significant. Signs that had probably been there all along, but I'd been too focused on defending myself from his attacks to see them. The worst part was watching my grandmother. She'd light up when he walked into a room, still brought him coffee exactly how he liked it every morning, still laughed at his old jokes like she was hearing them for the first time. 60 years of marriage, and she had no idea her husband was playing her for a fool. I thought about telling my parents, but what would that accomplish? It would just create more drama, more pain. Maybe it was better to let sleeping dogs lie. Maybe he'd end it on his own, and no one would ever have to know. Maybe I was being naive, but I kept hoping the problem would solve itself somehow. But as the weeks passed, his behavior toward me didn't change at all. If anything, it seemed to get worse. Like he was overcompensating for his own guilt by being extra hard on everyone else. Every dinner became another opportunity for him to tear me down, to remind me of all the ways I was failing to live up to his standards. Standards that, I now knew, he wasn't living up to himself. The breaking point was coming, and I could feel it building like pressure in a boiler. Something was going to give, and when it did, it wasn't going to be pretty. Update 2. Christmas was always the biggest production at my grandparents' house. My grandmother would start planning the menu in November, spend weeks shopping for presents, decorate every surface with lights and garland and little ceramic figurines she'd collected over the years. The dining room table would be set so perfectly it looked like something out of a magazine, with the good china and crystal glasses and cloth napkins folded into little swans. This year felt different from the moment I walked in the door. Maybe it was because I couldn't look at him the same way anymore. Maybe it was because I kept thinking about that woman in the car, wondering if he'd seen her recently, if he was planning to see her again. Or maybe it was just that I was finally getting tired of pretending everything was normal when it so obviously wasn't. The whole family was there, my parents, my aunt and uncle, my two cousins who were home from their own colleges. Everyone was in good spirits, exchanging presents, talking about their plans for the new year. My grandmother had outdone herself with the food. Turkey, ham, 3 different kinds of potatoes, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce that she'd made from scratch. The works. We'd made it through most of the meal without incident. He'd made a few comments about my hair being too long, asked if I was still wasting time with those books instead of learning something useful, but nothing too harsh. I was starting to think maybe I'd get through the evening without any major confrontations. That's when my cousin mentioned that he'd gotten an internship with a local company for the summer. Something in business, I think, or maybe finance. The details don't matter. What mattered was the way my grandfather's eyes lit up when he heard about it. Here was a grandson who was finally doing something he could be proud of, something that met his definition of success. He spent the next 10 minutes talking about how important it was to get real-world experience, how college was fine, but nothing beat actually working for a living. How young people today didn't understand the value of hard work, how they expected everything to be handed to them. All the usual talking points, but delivered with more enthusiasm than I'd seen from him in months. Then he turned to me. The transition was so smooth, so practiced, that I realized he'd probably been planning this moment since the salad course. Asked me what I was doing over the break, whether I'd given any more thought to changing my major to something practical. When I mentioned that I'd been working on a paper about American literature between the wars, he actually rolled his eyes. That's when he said it. The thing that broke something inside me that had been holding together by threads for months. He looked around the table, making sure he had everyone's attention, and announced that he was worried about me. Worried that I was turning into the same kind of person as my mother. Too soft, too emotional, not tough enough for the real world. He said it like he was genuinely concerned, like he was doing me a favor by pointing out my flaws in front of the entire family. My mother's face went white. My father's jaw tightened. My aunt and uncle suddenly became very interested in their plates. Even my cousins, who usually found his rants entertaining, looked uncomfortable. But he kept going. He talked about how his generation had fought wars and built the country, how they'd understood that life was hard and you had to be tougher than the challenges you faced. How young men today were being raised to be weak, to expect participation trophies instead of earning real victories. How someone needed to teach me what it meant to be a man before it was too late. I sat there listening to this speech, feeling the familiar burning in my chest that I'd been carrying around for 20 years. But this time, something was different. This time, instead of shrinking down and taking it, I felt something else rising up. Anger, maybe, or just exhaustion. I was tired of being his punching bag. Tired of listening to lectures about character and strength from someone who was living a lie. The whole table had gone quiet. Everyone was waiting to see how I'd respond, whether I'd defend myself or just sit there and take it like always. My grandmother was looking at me with this mixture of sympathy and helplessness, like she wanted to say something but didn't know how. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I looked straight at him, past all the other faces at the table, and asked him a simple question. Asked if he wanted to tell grandmother about the woman he'd been seeing at the shopping mall. Asked if he thought she'd be interested to know about his afternoon meetings in the parking lot. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was like someone had sucked all the air out of the room. You could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, could hear someone's fork clinking against their plate. But nobody moved, nobody breathed, nobody said a word. His face went through about 5 different colors in the space of 10 seconds. First red, then white, then something approaching purple. His mouth opened and closed like he was trying to form words, but couldn't remember how. For the first time in my life, I'd seen him completely speechless. My grandmother's reaction was what really broke my heart. She didn't gasp or cry or demand explanations. She just looked at him with this expression of perfect understanding, like a puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. Like she'd suspected something for a long time, but had been hoping she was wrong. She stood up slowly, folded her napkin carefully beside her plate, and walked out of the dining room without saying a word. We could hear her footsteps on the stairs, hear her bedroom door close with a soft click. The spell was broken then. Everyone started talking at once, asking questions, demanding explanations. My parents were staring at me like they'd never seen me before. My aunt was asking what I was talking about, whether I was sure about what I'd seen. My uncle was telling everyone to calm down. Let's not jump to conclusions. But my grandfather just sat there, staring at his plate, looking older than I'd ever seen him. All the bluster and authority had drained out of him like air from a punctured tire. He looked small somehow, diminished, like he'd been exposed as the fraud I now knew he was. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, he pushed back from the table and left too. Didn't say a word to anyone, didn't try to deny what I'd implied, didn't even look up as he walked past my chair. Just left us all sitting there with the ruins of Christmas dinner and the weight of what had just happened. Final update. The aftermath was messier than I'd expected, but also cleaner in some ways. My grandmother moved out the next week, went to stay with my aunt while she figured out what she wanted to do next. 60 years of marriage, and it ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet dignity that somehow made it even more heartbreaking. She never asked me for details about what I'd seen, never demanded explanations or proof. I think she'd known on some level for longer than any of us realized. Maybe she'd been waiting for someone else to say it out loud, so she could finally stop pretending everything was fine. My grandfather tried to call me a few times over the next couple of weeks. I never answered. What was there to say? Part of me felt guilty about the way everything had played out, about destroying Christmas dinner and hurting my grandmother and turning the whole family upside down. But a bigger part of me felt something I'd never experienced before, a sense of standing up for myself, of refusing to be anyone's verbal punching bag. The divorce papers were filed in February. 60 years of marriage ended because I couldn't keep my mouth shut, because I'd gotten tired of being lectured about character by someone who didn't have any, because sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to hit back, even when it hurts people you never meant to hurt. My grandmother got the house. She deserved that much after all those years of keeping his secrets and making his meals and laughing at his jokes. My grandfather moved into a small apartment across town, and from what I heard, the woman from the parking lot moved in with him pretty quickly. Guess they didn't see any point in hiding anymore. The family dinner stopped, obviously. We'd all get together for birthdays and holidays, but it wasn't the same. The center had been taken out of our family dynamic, and we were all still figuring out how to relate to each other without him there to dominate every conversation. It was quieter, but also more honest somehow. People said what they actually meant instead of what they thought he wanted to hear. My relationship with my parents got better. Without him there to criticize every choice I made, they could actually see me as an adult making his own decisions. My mom started asking about my classes, not because she felt obligated, but because she was genuinely interested. My dad and I started having real conversations instead of just polite small talk designed to avoid conflict. The biggest change was in how I saw myself. For 20 years, I'd carried around this voice in my head telling me I wasn't good enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't man enough. His voice, basically, telling me all the ways I was failing to meet his standards. But once I'd stood up to him, once I'd proven to myself that I could fight back when I needed to, that voice started getting quieter. I finished college with decent grades and a clearer sense of what I wanted to do with my life. Started dating someone I actually liked instead of someone I thought he might approve of. Got a job that didn't pay much but felt meaningful. Started making decisions based on what I wanted rather than what I thought would avoid criticism. Did I feel bad about what happened? Of course. I'd blown up my family over something that wasn't really my business. I'd hurt my grandmother, who'd never done anything but try to keep everyone happy. I'd turned a holiday dinner into a disaster that people would probably remember for the rest of their lives. But I also felt something else. Relief, maybe. Or just the absence of that constant low-level anxiety that had been my companion for as long as I could remember. The fear of saying the wrong thing, of not living up to impossible standards, of being found wanting by someone whose approval I'd never been able to earn. 6 months after everything went down, I ran into him at the grocery store. We were both in the cereal aisle, of all places, and there was no way to avoid each other without being obvious about it. He looked older, smaller somehow, like the divorce had taken something out of him that he couldn't get back. We nodded at each other, didn't speak, just acknowledged that we were both there and both aware of the elephant in the room. Then he grabbed his box of corn flakes and walked away, and I finished my shopping and went home. That was the last time I saw him. He died of a heart attack 2 years later, still living in that apartment with the woman from the parking lot. I went to the funeral, sat in the back, didn't say anything to anyone. My grandmother was there too, dressed in black, dignified as always. She'd moved on by then, started volunteering at the library, had her own life that didn't revolve around taking care of someone who'd stopped appreciating her decades ago. Looking back, I don't know if what I did was right or wrong. I know it was messy and painful and changed everything for everyone involved. But I also know that for the first time in my life, I'd stood up for myself. I'd refused to be diminished by someone else's need to feel superior. The kid who used to shrink down in his chair every Sunday, waiting for the next criticism, the next reminder of how he was failing to measure up, that kid was gone. In his place was someone who understood that you don't have to accept other people's definitions of who you are. Someone who knew that sometimes the only way to stop being treated like a doormat is to get up off the floor. I'm not proud of how it all went down, but I'm not ashamed of it either. Sometimes life forces you to make choices that don't have clean, happy endings. Sometimes standing up for yourself means accepting that you're going to hurt people, including people you love. Sometimes the only way forward is through the mess you've made. And sometimes, when you're lying in bed at night, you realize that the voice in your head criticizing every move you make has finally gone quiet. That's when you know you made the right choice, even if it was the hard one. I sleep better now.